Occulture show. We're back. You probably know we're back, but we're better than ever and weirder than ever. I'm Lilith Dorsey, and this is my co-host.
I'm Jason Winslade, and
And, in the past, we did shows that were, about classics, things like Wizard of Oz, things like The Craft, things like that, and now we're branching out into things that are stranger. We had our inaugural return last week with a very amazing discussion about pop culture and burlesque and the history of that. And go back and watch it if you didn't see it, because it was a great show. And I just want to thank everybody for watching. We dipped out, and that's like a colossal rule of don't do this when you're creating content. But we're back, and we're going to do our best to be consistent now. So thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing to the Patreon, to liking, sharing, commenting, all of those things, because we really do appreciate it.
we're so glad to be back because it's really fun to do this and get to have these conversations with people on the show and off. So it's really awesome to be back.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to let you announce it fully, but tonight we're talking about one of my favorite
Um,
topics.
we're going to talk about the phenomenon, which I was previously unaware of, but was educated to thanks to Lilith. Um, and it is the phenomenon of Coffin Joe, or how do you say it?
I apologize to any Brazilians out there, but I believe it's cheiro cacau. That's what I believe it is. So my Brazilian Portuguese is not great, so I apologize, but that's what it sounds like to me. So
And it's the
um,
filmmaker José Mojica Marin.
Marines,
Marin,
yes.
please, okay.
Yeah, and I mean, the way I discovered it was just completely and totally by accident. I had to think about it this morning, but it was back in the early, I think 2010 or 2011, that a documentary about Coffin Joe was screened at the New York Underground Film Festival. I
Mm.
think that's what it was. It was so long ago. I have a T-shirt somewhere because I was working it, but everybody was all hyped up and jazzed up to watch this film because it's such a cult classic, and this documentary talks about the cult classic and the phenomena that is Coffin Joe. And for me, it's sort of unique, I think, in its place in history, because we've got the first Brazilian horror character that was ever created. There's a lot of myth and magic surrounding Coffin Joe, and there's a lot of lines that get blurred here between, spirituality and sort of agnosticism and the church, and all of these things that sort of blend together in this film. And honestly, it's one of the weirdest damn things you'll ever see.
It was the first Brazilian horror film, period, right?
Yes, yes. Marines grew up in, his parents owned a movie theater. So he grew up kind of in that atmosphere of the darkness and seeing the lights flickering on the screen. That would have been my dream as a kid, honestly. Like if
To
my
grow up in a
parents
movie
owned a
theater.
movie theater,
Yeah,
right? Like all the popcorn in the world and all the movies in the world and
sure.
all of that, but it became clear really early that he was going to make movies. And again, it's just some of the strangest stuff you're ever going to see created out of his own mind, really out of his own nightmares, I think. And that's one of the things that you get when you watch them and when you hear the stuff he talks about in the documentary. But, I guess I'll say this, it all started with the character, and, he plays the character himself of Coffin Joe. The first real big movie that he made about it was At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul, which I've got varying reports. It was either 1963 or 1964, but there's so many things in this that I think are sort of classic 60s horror. There's parts of it when I'm watching it that remind me of Night of the Living Dead, that remind me of some of these other kinds of really extreme kitschy, like, out there kinds of horror things. And honestly, I just wish I was an extra in this, not with spiders on me. We'll get to that later, but
I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that set, but yeah, yeah.
I
So
just love the extreme of it. I just do.
yeah, he is such an interesting character. I mean, so he grew up in Sao Paulo, and it was like a neighborhood of Sao Paulo, right? And I watched a documentary. I don't know if it's the same documentary that you're referring to, but that the one that was on that we found on YouTube, that was interviews with him. I want to say it was like in the 90s. Um,
Yes.
and so yeah, I mean, he tells that one of the things that kind of like struck me was a story that he told about someone who was a potato seller. Do you remember that story? He was a potato
Yes, I
seller,
love that story.
and he died, and they were having a funeral for him, and he was saying how the wife was like, you know, pleading to the heavens. He's like, this was more dramatic than anything I'd ever seen from an actress, and they were all praying for him to come back, and he does, because I guess he had some kind of a seizure and didn't actually die, and they all freak out, and his wife leaves him. He winds up dying years later in an asylum because he's been like, he felt like he's been cursed by the community and this whole thing. And so Marines is talking about how, like, well, he saw this hypocrisy in this superstitious religious belief that, like, well, you pray for him to come back, but he does, and then this is what you do to him. So yeah, like that really, when I saw some of the scenes from the films, I was like, that really informed his, not only his ethos, but his aesthetic too. And you know, the whole idea that you don't want these things that you pray for, because you know you're not going to be happy with the result. And it's
No,
pretty,
it's
pretty
true. I
dark
mean,
stuff.
I feel like that's magic 101. Careful what you wish for, right? Like, and I think that in a lot of ways, both the films and his life is this kind of very precarious balance of, you know, wanting, needing, and then, you know, the reality of what actually shows up. You know, I mean, he talks about the image for when he first came out with this came to a nightmare, right? It came to him in a nightmare where something was
Right.
just sort of creeping towards his bed in the middle of the night, talking about snatching his soul away.
And
And
dragging him to his grave.
yes. So we've already got these kinds of things that were placed in his mind, obviously, because of, you know, the socioeconomic climate at the time, and also, you know, where artistic expression was at the time. But also, for me, it's such a beautiful example of realism in a way. And I know people are going to be going, what the hell is she talking about? But just the way that he has things so immediate, you know. I remember watching the documentary, and there's a scene where he's like literally putting people with spiders on them, and, you know, snakes and things like that. And it's such an extreme, you know, I can't even imagine, oh, okay, the director's like, oh, we're going to have a method moment. I'm going to throw real snakes on you. You couldn't get away with it now.
But yeah, he put real snakes on these women, and tarantulas, and there are stories about how he had basically had to get them drunk just to do the scene, to get through the scenes. And so these women are, or they're on drugs or whatever. Like, these women are like just messed up while all
They
this
are.
is happening to them, and they're, you know, they're screaming real screams because they're covered in tarantulas. It's
Yeah.
insane.
No, there's definitely no feminism at work here. But I do want to say you see people sort of lining up almost to be in these movies. So, like, it definitely has a cult following. It has this sense that you know, people really wanted to take part of it in this, especially after the first film. You know, and the first film is full of such tropes, you know, not just the drag me to my grave tropes, but so many great things about, like, you know, he's got a line about blood. What is it? He's like, what is blood? The reason to exist. Like, he's got all these fantastic statements to me that are just almost, they're cliche, but they're also iconic, you know, that crafts him as this new horror villain, you know. And this is something we saw later. You know, we were talking earlier about, you know, Freddy Krueger and the sort of creation of horror icons that happened, you know, basically in the 80s and beyond. But I think that for this being 1963, it almost immediately took off. There were several sequels and things like that. So you've got this kind of people literally, and this is what we talk about on this show, right? People worshiping the silver screen, people worshiping these characters that are larger than life. And as this, I guess we didn't say this yet, but he's sort of this, coffin, whatever, gravedigger, coffin seller person who
Yeah,
gets to be
let's talk
there.
about the character itself. Like, who is
Yes,
Coffin Joe?
he's got long fingernails.
He's got the
He's
long
got,
fingernails. He's a mortuary is a caretaker originally, like, right?
yes.
So he starts off as a relatively normal but gothed up mortuary assistant, but then he like gets evil or something like that.
I feel like he starts out evil. You know what I mean? There's this sort of eschewing of all of this religious church beliefs. The opening scenes in the movie is him sort of having this machismo moment where he's like, bring me meat. And, his partner's like, no, it's Good Friday. We can't do that. He's like, I'm going to go get a lamb and kill it. And he sort of eats it in the window while the church
Right, yeah.
is
He's
going
watching the
by.
priest go by. Yeah, so it starts with sacrilege. It's all of
Yes,
that. It's
sacrilege.
rebellion against the church and basically telling people their beliefs are crap, and just thumbing his nose wherever he can. But then it goes from there to, I'm gonna really mess with you.
Oh, definitely. He's just seen as, this kind of ultimate narcissist psychopath who just, he decides he can't get the woman he wants because
Right.
his girlfriend's in the way, so he kills the girlfriend. I'm not really spoiling anything. This happens in the beginning.
Yeah.
But as we see it unfold, he just sort of takes out everybody who's in his way in the most fiendish and creepy and low budget ways that you can imagine.
There was the one scene I loved where he took the crown of thorns from a Jesus statue and uses it to like shove it into this guy's face, like super gory. I'm like, wow, that talk about like over the hammer on the head symbolism there. But the funny thing is, he protects children though,
He does.
which is this
He does.
interesting, like, I mean, talk about like politics, and there's all kinds of stuff we could talk about later on with the Brazilian military and all that, where you get censored by them, not because of the horror, but because of like drugs and sex. But
yes.
But yeah, so he protects children. So it's this interesting look. He's like a boogeyman character, but but children are off limits.
Yes, and in a way, in that scene where they show it, it's almost that he's championing, for this child that's in a difficult situation, so you've got this sort of commentary on both society and parental attitudes and things like that, again sort of butting up against the norm of the time. And I was very careful to watch it to see if he was sort of like, yay, Satan. And he's not. Like, this is just totally a character. The line is, I can't disbelieve when I never had any beliefs. So it's not that he's, going over to the other side, it's just that he's doing what he wants
He's
to.
full on nihilist. It's
yes,
full on
yes.
like atheism, nihilism. Some people call it Nietzschean even.
Yes. Yes, he's almost this iconic Nietzschean figure where he's just, screw everything and I'm going to do what I want, right? And it just gets creepier and creepier as time goes by. But you're right. He's got this thing where, he shoves the crucifix, crown of thorns in his face. I love the way that in his apartment, like all the hooks are hands. Like, we don't know if this is from actual bodies or something, but like, he's just hanging up his jacket on the hand and there's hands everywhere.
Over the top stuff. I mean, I was saying about like I watched clips and scenes from the films, and I watched the documentary, and I was like, I'm good. That's all I need. I don't know that I could handle 2 hours of this. It's pretty gruesome. And then there's like I don't remember which one it was. I think maybe it was the Exorcism one, where it's like people are just like eating hands and like they're like having a cannibal banquet, like just over the top grossness. But so the first one was you said around 64. At midnight I'll take your soul, and then the second one was This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse. Such a lovely title. 1967. And so yeah, he was doing these films, and the character, I think he dies at the first one, but then of course gets retconned in the middle. So this is before this is before Friday the 13th and Freddy Krueger, you know, like the whole idea where like, oh, the villain dies at the end, but we're gonna bring it back and show how he didn't actually die at the last one. So this is like before any of these things that we're so used to with horror, you know, supervillains. He's doing it with Coffin Joe. And what I find really interesting, just as you know, from my performance studies background, is the way that the character becomes not only meta in it was a, I want to say that it was the exorcism of I don't know, yeah, the bloody exorcism of Coffin Joe, which is 74, where Marines plays himself as a director who gets haunted by Coffin Joe. So this is before the Wes Craven's New Nightmare, whenever that was, where Wes Craven's a character in his own film getting haunted by Freddy Krueger. So like he's done all this stuff, and then because he's so popular in Brazil, he becomes a host of an anthology show, like an Alfred Hitchcock thing, a Rod Serling thing, and there was even a point. There was a point in the I want to say early '90s where there was a Freddy Krueger Nightmare on Elm Street anthology show where Freddy was the host, mm-hmm. So, and sometimes he would be in the show, but sometimes not in the story. So it's like, so now he becomes a horror show host like the Ghoul. Yeah, I mean, he had this reputation. I mean, like this whole thing about him being like cursed. He was born on Friday the 13th, and in the interview in the documentary, he's like, well, at least nobody died on set, but he had this problem with his actresses dying from, like, one of them had tuberculosis, one of them like died in a car crash. There's this whole thing where like his cameraman died, but like doesn't really explain how that happened. He predicts it, and so like people are like, I don't think these sets are approved by SAG-AFTRA or
no.
for that matter, with the tarantulas being crushed and stuff.
Not a union production at all.
Oh yeah, I mean he was not a role model for filmmakers for sure.
No.
I mean, you get nightmares watching the film. I can't imagine being on that set, like how haunted those people probably were and traumatized from being on
definitely.
that set. And he talked about like he was basically on amphetamines the whole time, and then
sure.
He's doing because he only has so much money and time, so he's doing the entire shoot over 3 days without sleeping and not giving anybody breaks.
Yep.
Well,
I mean, you go legally insane, right? After you're deprived of sleep long enough, and some of those color scenes to me remind me almost of The Trip or something, you know what I mean? Where you've gone into this weird psychedelic universe. And there was an article, I didn't get to read it, but where they talk about Marines having his own metaphysics in the universe of Coffin Joe, which I think is a fascinating concept. I'm not stealing it, I didn't read it, but I just love this. It's like things do operate differently in this Coffin Joe verse, right? Like, and even differently watching it now, almost, decades and decades after it was created. But there's some things that I think are universals. That scene in the first film where he's at the grave and he's sort of like taking the liquor off the grave and drinking it and taking the money off the grave and stuffing it in his pocket. It's almost that he's challenging this sort of ancestral worship on the deepest level. And that's finally when things start to close in on him, where he sort of, eats meat in the face of Catholicism, and he has that whole interaction with the bruja. And it's almost that, she's just like, well, you better not do that. And he's like, screw you, lady, and it just keeps escalating. And when he gets up to the point where he's completely not even listening to the dead anymore, not even following those basic things of respect and convention that we deal with, in a lot of the occult traditions, that's when it all, gets tipped to the dark side for him, and not in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because he's both victim and victimizer as a character. And so, yeah, in that bloody exorcism of Coffin Joe movie, that it seems like there's a lot more occult elements in that. There's a witch and rituals, and and things like that. So yeah, I mean, what tell us more about like what makes this a cult in the sense of, because you're talking about the creation of the character is a magical act. What else about the Coffin Joe phenomenon that a culture people should pay attention to?
Well, I think, I mean, as I was just saying, I think that there's a way in which it sort of drifts into the African traditional religions of Candomblé and Umbanda. You know, even in the early film, he's got this look at him where he's sort of mesmerizing people, right? And anybody who knows anything about the history of Brazil and spiritism and Mesmer himself and things like that, there was a lot of heavily based alternative occult practices that were dealing with things like mesmerism, things like trance, things like spirit possession, all of those things. And it's sort of like he commands that energy in that. And then also there were always rumors that people literally started praying to Coffin Joe, that there were altars and things like that set up for him, which I think is fascinating, again, if we think about African traditional religions, because we're talking about religions where someone dies, right? Like he does at the end of the first film, and then they are honored, then they become venerated, then they become worshipped, for lack of a better word. So it's almost that this transformation that he goes through allows him to become, in some ways, and there's the air quotes, deified in this tradition and in people who are familiar with these traditions. So for me, it's this kind of, I've created, like you said, meta on top of meta on top of meta. Like the director has created a character. In a lot of ways, he's become the character. And in a lot of ways, that has in turn unfolded in the creation of a divinity in some respects. And I think that's fascinating because I think a lot of what we see in especially modern occultism is a very laissez-faire attitude to it. Okay, it's all about the hats and the you know the trappings of being a witch, as opposed to the reality of worship and honoring both nature spirits and the ancestors and things like that. But people tend to deify these pop culture images, right? How many people do you know? Look, you've got your pop culture shirt on today with the Cure on it.
Yep. Yeah, Robert Smith in his
So,
full skeletal mode.
but I mean, I think these things are larger than life, and we do treat them like gods and goddesses and divine beings in a lot of different ways.
There's that fine line between the idolization, the iconization of pop culture figures and deification in that religious sense. You know, if people talk about, I don't know, Coffin Joe being a Loa, just like maybe I don't know if you would worship Freddy Krueger, but like, you know, some kind of thing that like has this sort of power over, you know, I guess Freddy Krueger is the dark side of Morpheus, of the god of sleep and dreams, you know, Dream from Sandman. But you know, there's all those ways that we take a figure and make them an entity, an egregore, if you will, in the occult sense, where, you know, all that focus is put on them, just like any idol, any deity in any tradition. So there's interesting connection there. So they're going to reboot Coffin Joe, apparently, with of all people, Elijah Wood's Spectre Vision, I guess is his production company. I can't imagine Elijah would be in it himself, but who knows? I mean, he is creepy enough, but maybe
I would love that. I would love him to be Coffin Joe. You know, I mean, the article we were looking at was a couple of years old, but you know, now it takes a very long time to get things done in Hollywood. So I'm hoping it's still on the table. I would love to see that.
Well, apparently there's I think this month they're releasing an entire Blu-ray collection of all of the Coffin Joe film, all of that stuff together, so like people can actually see the you know, dismemberment and cannibalism and, you know, in full Blu-ray glory. So there's obviously a market for this stuff. Because, you know, at first, you know, when you told me about it, it made it sound like, oh, it was just some like YouTube guy somewhere. But no, this is, you know, a full-on a legacy, and I believe his daughter has carried on his tradition as a sort of a horror host. I think she goes by Liz Vamp, and she has kind of like a Brazilian Elvira thing happening, just a lot more red in the outfit. You know, kind of along the lines of some of that some of the Church of Satan stuff. Like, she reminds me of some of those folks in the way that she presents herself. So there's there's that full-on tradition from you know, going back to the 60s when he did his stuff.
I mean, I think I presented it to you like that because when I first saw it, it was this thing that you couldn't get anywhere, you
Right.
know? And when I first got the films on DVD, it was so hard. It was only, you know, you had to go to that one weird store that carried the really weird stuff, you know, and we both, you know, are in large cities, so that makes it a tiny bit easier. But it was something that nobody had seen when it was at the you know, film festival that was at. So I think it's something that, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, has been rediscovered. And I'm all about that. Like, I'm all about the weird and the creepy and the extreme, and how Marin sort of blends all of these things together so kitschily and stereotypically, but also artistically. Like, to me, it's so out there that it's in there, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and he did have an impact. He was I believe he got a whole bunch of international awards and a decent amount of recognition, but yet he was pretty destitute. He didn't really
Yes.
get money from that. And you know, people like Tim Burton were fans. So yeah, there's definitely that pretty direct influence, but just not talked about. I mean, in general, most of us in you know, in America and the West don't. Well, it's I guess Brazil is the West too, but the English speaking world is not very aware of you know, Latin cinema in general, let alone Brazilian horror,
Sure.
which is, you know, such
Sure.
a category. So there's just a, you know, I'd be very interested to see what the impact of any kind of a reboot or reimagining would be, and what the cultural conversation around that would be, especially the fact that clearly they're going to anglicize it. I mean, I would assume, maybe I'm wrong.
Definitely. I'm not even sure you could do it in the same context. Like I said, I don't think you could
Sure.
do it without such a strong, you know, Christian country, such a strong ATR country. That's like, there are things that are uniquely Brazilian. And I think that if you remove that from the story, you're going to get a very different story, but
I
hopefully
mean,
a good one.
I suppose you could do it in like a Bible Belt South, Southern context, and I mean the flavor of it would be very different, but at least that sort of sacrilegious quality might be present. Who knows? I'm
What's he
curious.
going to do? Dance? It's going to be like Coffin Joe Footloose. Like, I don't.
There we go. There we go. Well, you know, he's gonna go to drag shows, and
Right.
yeah, and
Oh,
he'll put dirty books in libraries. I don't know.
God.
Never know
I
about.
don't know. I don't know. I guess we'll see what
Okay.
happens. But I recommend the originals. I mean, you need a strong stomach, and you need to know. I mean, all good cult films are weird AF, right? Like, I was thinking about Rocky Horror today. You were talking about, you know, John Waters. There's a lot of parallels there that are just, you know, okay, I'm gonna watch Divine eat this pile of, you know,
Yeah.
but it's got its own special niche. And if you like that, I would recommend this wholeheartedly.
I mean, I made sure that even the documentary, I was like, I'm going to watch this in the morning, not at night before I go to sleep. So, I believe our next episode, we're going to get more into the spooky season and talk Buffy, which is one of my favorite things. And I'll have to show you why on that day, and walk around my apartment to show you all the signed Buffy things, because it's a thing.
Didn't that used to be in your bio? I used to introduce you as the Buffyologist. I still do
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes.
I actually had the Buffyologist T-shirt. I'll probably wear that for the next show. You gotta have your occult appropriate T-shirts. Yeah, so join us next week for the Pop Occulture show. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. watch for our new releases, join our Patreon site, patreon.com/Pop Occulture show, and just be in our weird, strange, fun world for a little bit.
Sounds good to me. And don't forget to let us know what you think. Please like, share, comment. If there's something you want to see a new show about, let us know. All right. Have a great day, night. Don't get dragged anywhere in your sleep. That's what I have to say.
Go to drag, but don't get dragged.
Bye.